Hi, everyone, and welcome to this deep dive. Today, we're looking closely at something really significant, potentially a major step towards stability in South Asia. We're talking about the recent India-Pakistan ceasefire agreement and the very positive welcome it's received, especially from the UK.
Yes, it's a fascinating development. And it's not just the agreement itself, but, the context around it. Why now? And what could it really mean?
Exactly. And to help us unpack all of this, we're really pleased to have an expert with us. We're joined today by Dr. Arjun Mehta. He's a senior fellow in South Asian geopolitics at the Center for Strategic Futures. Now, many of you might also know Dr. Mehta from his great work over on the Westferry Times podcast. So a big thank you to the Westferry Times for letting us borrow his expertise today.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me. And yes, hello to everyone watching from Westferry Times.
Great. So our mission today is to really get a handle on this ceasefire. What are the details? Why is the UK so engaged? And importantly, what could this mean for people on the ground and for the wider geopolitical picture? Let's start with the basics then. This agreement announced recently, what exactly is it?
Right. So on May 20th, India and Pakistan put out a joint statement. They basically reaffirmed their commitment to the ceasefire agreement from way back in 2003, specifically along the line of control, the Law Sea in Kashmir.
Wow, the Law Sea, the de facto border there.
Precisely. Now, technically, that 2003 ceasefire was still in place, but let's be honest, it's been violated countless times over the years.
Hmm.
What feels different, potentially this time, is that both sides explicitly acknowledge the huge human cost
Hmm.
and the economic burden of the conflict.
Ah, okay. So that acknowledgement is key.
I think so. That mutual recognition, it hints that maybe, just maybe, there's a real opening here for genuinely better relations.
So it's a recommitment, but with perhaps a new tone. What factors do you think brought them to this point right now? It does feel like a potentially significant moment.
It seems like a confluence of things, really. Both countries have been facing significant pressures, internally and externally.
Like what?
Well, economically, neither country is having an easy time, and the constant tension certainly doesn't help that. And there also seems to be, a growing weariness with the conflict among ordinary people in both India and Pakistan, a real desire for peace.
That makes sense. The human cost.
Absolutely. And then you have the bigger picture. The U.S. seems more focused strategically on the Asia-Pacific region these days, and the UK has been quite vocal about wanting to use its soft power, its
Ah,
diplomatic influence. Maybe that created some space or even incentive.
right. The external dynamics playing a role too. Okay, let's pivot to the UK's reaction then. You mentioned they've been supportive. How specifically did they respond?
Very positively. The UK government, we heard statements from Prime Minister Keir Starmer and also Foreign Secretary David Lammy. They publicly welcomed the ceasefire, calling it something like a vital step toward peace and stability in South Asia.
Strong words.
Yes. And they made sure to mention the UK's deep historical ties with both India and Pakistan. And they expressed hope, that this could lead to more confidence-building measures down the line.
Okay, so this is the really interesting part for me. Why is the UK so invested? As you say, long historical ties, but why this level of focus on peace between India and Pakistan?
Well, there are several layers to it, I think. First, and perhaps most directly, is the diaspora. The UK has very large, very vibrant communities with roots in both India and Pakistan. What happens in the region matters deeply here.
Right, it affects people living in the UK directly.
Exactly. Social cohesion, family ties, all of that. Secondly, there's the UK's global positioning, especially post-Brexit. London seems keen to carve out a role as a significant diplomatic player, a global peacemaker, if you like.
Yeah.
Supporting this fits that narrative.
Okay, so a geopolitical ambition too.
Definitely. And thirdly, there are practical interests. Stability in South Asia is good for UK economic interests, trade, investment, you name it. And it links into broader global security partnerships, too. A less volatile South Asia makes for a more predictable world, which is, well, generally good for everyone.
Let's bring it back down to the ground level. What could this ceasefire actually mean for ordinary people, especially those living right near the line of control or in Kashmir?
Oh, the potential difference is huge. For people in those border areas, the most immediate thing would be simply less fear, less risk of being killed or injured by cross-border shelling, which has been a tragic, everyday reality for so long.
Just the absence of that daily threat must be immense.
Immense. It could mean schools reopening safely, allowing children to actually get an education without constant disruption. It might mean farmers can finally go back to their fields near the border without risking their lives.
Practical things like farming, schooling.
Yes, and even the possibility, maybe, of reopening some local trade routes, which could bring a bit of economic life back to those areas.
You mentioned earlier when we were chatting a specific story from the Westferry Times that really brought this home.
Yes, Westferry Times reported on a really moving example just this week, a school in Kashmir. It had been closed for months because of the fighting, the shelling, and it finally reopened. And the report mentioned children walking to school, without hearing gunfire in the background.
Wow.
It sounds simple, but it powerfully illustrates the tangible difference diplomacy, like this ceasefire, can make. That's why these efforts matter so much.
That really puts it into perspective. But, we have to be realistic. Given the history here, the decades of mistrust, there's got to be skepticism about whether this ceasefire will actually last.
Oh, absolutely. That skepticism is completely understandable, even necessary, perhaps. History is littered with ceasefires between India and Pakistan that have eventually broken down. Trust is incredibly fragile.
So what are the main dangers? What could derail this?
Several things. Militant activity crossing the border is always a potential flashpoint. That hasn't gone away. Even small skirmishes, if they're not handled very carefully by both military commands, could escalate quickly.
Miscalculation is a risk.
A huge risk. And then there's politics. A shift in government, or even just domestic political pressure in either country, could easily lead to a hardening of positions again.
So it's positive, but fragile. What role could a country like the UK play in trying to help sustain this fragile peace?
Well, the UK is in a somewhat unique position given its history and ties. It could potentially act as a neutral facilitator, not mediating directly, perhaps, but supporting dialogue channels.
Keeping communication open.
Yes. And they could also offer practical support, like funding cross-border projects, think educational exchanges, or maybe joint environmental initiatives, things that build connections below the official level.
Grassroots connections.
Exactly. And supporting what's called Track 2 diplomacy, getting academics, former officials, civil society groups from both sides talking, that can sometimes break log jams that official channels can't.
Interesting. Let's zoom out again. If, and it's still an if, but if this ceasefire holds and maybe even leads to something more stable, what does that mean geopolitically for South Asia's place in the world?
A genuinely stable South Asia, with India and Pakistan not locked in conflict, that would be transformative. Think of the resources, financial and human, that could be redirected from military readiness towards development, trade, innovation. It could unlock significant economic potential for the whole region.
And for the UK?
For the UK, it means a much more stable, predictable, and attractive region for investment and partnership. It reinforces the idea that diplomacy, that soft power, still works, even in really tough situations.
And what about other big players? How does this fit into the picture with, say, China's growing influence in the region?
That's a really important angle. China's influence, particularly economically through initiatives like the Belt and Road, is undeniable in Pakistan and the wider region.
Right.
But a more peaceful and cooperative South Asia, with India and Pakistan perhaps trading more freely and focusing inward on development, might actually reduce the region's reliance on any single external power.
So could create more balance.
Potentially, yes. It could open up space for stronger partnerships with the UK, with the EU, with the US, offering alternatives. So yes, a lasting peace could genuinely start to reshape the geopolitical map there.
We actually got a couple of really good questions from listeners via the Westferry Times feed. Let's tackle those. First one is, looking ahead, could this ceasefire realistically pave the way for a formal peace treaty? Big question.
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Look, a formal peace treaty is the ultimate aspiration, but we have to be realistic about the timeline. This ceasefire really holding for a sustained period, that's the absolute first step. That's the priority.
Building some basic stability first.
Exactly. If that happens, maybe then you could see steps towards normalizing trade, more people-to-people contact. You need to build that bedrock of, well, maybe not trust initially, but predictability and reduced hostility. Then maybe you can start talking about a formal peace framework. But it's a long road.
Okay, cautious optimism, step by step. Makes sense. Second question, will this ceasefire have any immediate effect on UK immigration or student visa policies for people from India or Pakistan?
In the short term, almost certainly not.
Yeah.
UK immigration and visa policies are driven primarily by domestic factors, economic needs, internal politics.
Not directly linked to a ceasefire announcement.
No. However, thinking longer term, if we did see genuine lasting stability in South Asia, if relations improve significantly,
Yeah.
then it's conceivable, down the line, that could foster greater collaboration in areas like education, technology, research, and that might eventually lead to discussions about, say, improved mobility agreements or easier exchanges. But that's a long way off, contingent on sustained peace.
Understood. Well, this has been incredibly insightful. Thank you so much for walking us through the complexities of this situation. It's really helped clarify things.
It's been my pleasure. It's a critical moment, and let's just hope, for everyone's sake in the region, that this positive momentum can be sustained.
Let's hope so indeed. And to you, our listeners, thank you as always for joining us for this deep dive. We've covered the ceasefire itself, the UK's supportive stance and why, the potential human impact, the hurdles that still remain, and the broader geopolitical chessboard.
And maybe a final thought to leave you with is this. Beyond just stopping the shooting, what could genuine, lasting peace between India and Pakistan truly unlock? What kind of future could that open up, not just for South Asia, but for the world?
A powerful question to reflect on. Thank you again for diving deep with us today. Until next time, take care.